I asked, where did you teach? And where did you teach?
I taught at Dennis Yarmouth High School. And I went to Dennis Yarmouth High School. And I grew up in Brewster. So I'm a down caper to, you know, I didn't discover Falmouth until a couple of years ago when I moved to Sandwich. I'd never really been here.
Yeah.
For us, living down that way, the Cape didn't begin till you got the Bass River, so. But I find this really beautiful up here, and I live right in the center of Sandwich now, and it's really the quintessential New England village, beautiful village. But I love to come to Falmouth. It's just that it's not easy to get here. A lot of people tell me that. Once I get here, though, I think it's really a beautiful town.
Yeah.
You've got a lot here, and I think your main street is just perfect. You know, you've got a nice combination of retail, restaurants, and a
There's
bookstore.
7 beaches.
And they're good. They're warm water.
Yes.
Now, when I jump into the water over in Sandwich and it's about 60 degrees, I freeze. Then I get out. I like to think of come back over here. You know, after 4 o'clock, of course, so I can get on the beach. And the temperatures are reasonable.
And what subject do you teach for this?
History.
History?
History.
American, world?
Well, when you're a high school teacher, you know, you walk in the fall and they say, okay, here's what you got. You got one section American history, you got another section European history, a couple sections of ancient history, and I used to run an elective on Cape Cod history because that's my thing. When you live here your whole life, you know, that becomes kind of the center of what you write about and what you think about and what you're concerned with.
How long has your family been here?
How long has the family been here?
Yeah.
Actually, not long. We're not, you know, Crosbys or Freemans or Crowells or, I think my people must have swum the river at some point, you know, probably illegally, but my parents actually were city people and they grew up in Boston. And for them to come to Brewster in the 1940s from the city, it was like a wilderness. There were less than 900 people that lived in the town. I always tell the story. My father was a Dorchester Irishman, and you know, after the war, he went to work at the shipyard up there in Quincy, and then they started laying off people. And my mother apparently had an experience with the Cape. Well, I shouldn't say the Cape, onset. You know, that's where they met. And my mother had this brainstorm. She said, let's move to the Cape. And I don't think my father ever really, you know, it never really set with him, even though they lived here 50 years or more. But he always told me the story that he went into Brewster Town Hall to register to vote, and Alpheus Percy Newcomb was the town clerk. He'd been the town clerk for about 40 some odd years. He said to my father, what do you want to be? And my father said, a Democrat. Well, Newcomb just about fell off the chair. He said, we haven't had a Democrat come through here since the priest ran a mission in the 1920s. So my father always said that, you know, they made him sit on the balcony for about 5 years before they let him come down with all those Republicans. The Cape was really still pretty much the old Yankees at that point in the 1940s. But I was lucky. I really got to grow up like Huckleberry Finn. I had the woods and the beaches and the flats to run on and roam on with no restrictions whatsoever. If I wanted to go sea clamming out there, I went out and I'd bring a mason jar with me, shuck them out there and bring them home. You know, none of this bring them home in the bag stuff. Now I take my grandson fishing in the canal, and you can't gut and fillet the fish there. You got to take them home, and you know, they don't want, you know, they want to know how many you caught. So, I mean, there's so many regulations. It's very different now. I was lucky. I was really lucky. I got in on the tail end of what the Cape was. It's very different now, and I think in a way, when I get started, I'll explain why I wrote the book and how I wanted to sort of capture what was and is no longer. So.
I almost feel like I don't need to do an introduction.
Well, I always get going. I'm never a person for a lot of protocol. Matter of fact, I'm often embarrassed when people, after I hear the introduction, I wonder, who was that guy that just came on? But I'll give you a shot here because it's probably the way
Do you
have
want to
run
read
it.
through this before I read it? Sure it's accurate. All right, here goes. Thanks for coming out tonight, everybody. Jim Coogan was raised on Cape Cod in the town of Brewster. After military service, he began a career as a high school history teacher. Since his retirement from teaching in 1999, Jim has written 7 books about Cape Cod, including Sail Away Ladies, Stories of Cape Cod Women in the Age of Sail, which received the 2004 U.S. Maritime Literature Award for Best Maritime Writing by an independent publisher. His book, Cape Cod Harvest, A Gathering of Cape Cod Stories, written with Dennis author Jack Sheedy and published in the spring of 2007, was a finalist in Forward Magazine's 2007 Book of the Year Awards. More recently, Jim has moved toward writing books for children as well as novels. His debut novel, Sears Point, is set in Brewster and tells the story of Washington Foster Washi Sears, who witnesses the transition of Cape Cod from the traditional rural life to the realities and challenges of today's world. Jim is a regular columnist for the Cape Cod Times daily newspaper and is owner and publisher of Harvest Home Books in East Dennis, Massachusetts. He lives with his wife in Sandwich.
Not bad, you did all right on that one. I'm no longer a columnist for the Cape Cod Times. I did that for 18 years, and then about a year ago I started to realize I didn't know as much as I thought I knew in all those columns I wrote, and I decided, maybe it's time to call it a day. And so I'm no longer a columnist, but I did it for a long time, and that kind of points out really the background of writing that I have. I am not a writer by any kind of professional training. I never went to school to learn to be a writer. I just like to write. And as a teacher, I never had much time to write because you're always like one page ahead of the kids when you're trying to, keep all the things going, the balls in the air. But I always like to write. And I think back probably in the mid-1980s, I started submitting some things to newspapers, mostly related to history, Cape Cod history. And then the editor of the Cape Cod Times called me and said, you want to do some writing for us? And I said, sure, I'd like to. I had a little more time at that point. My kids were up and on the way to college, so there wasn't such a pressure there. And then I met a young fellow. He and I were writing together for the Barnesville Patriot newspaper. He's almost like a son to me. He's 20 years younger than I am. And we hit it off very well. His name is Jack Sheedy, another Irishman. He lives in Dennis. And we wrote a lot of stuff for the newspaper. And at one point, Jack said to me, he said, we get enough stuff that we could do a book. And I had never thought of anything like this. Again, I don't have any real professional background, no school, no journalism school or anything like that. So I said, well, okay, what do we do? And he said, well, we'll find a publisher. So we had a bunch of our stories that we put together in a book. And we found a publisher. And the publisher said, hey, this looks pretty good. But then he sat on it for quite a period of time. It was almost like 8 months before we even heard from him. And then he said, hey, I'm going out of business. And you can have your manuscript back. So here we had a manuscript. And trying to find a publisher. I've talked to a lot of writers now, and you're knocking on doors, writing letters. You never hear anything from, either an agent or a publisher. It's just almost difficult. So Jack said, well, why don't we do it ourselves? We can do that. And I said, I haven't got the slightest idea what you're talking about, Jack. He said, no, we'll do it step by step. So we had a local graphic designer put our manuscript into electronic format. We picked out a pretty good cover, and then we ran off a bunch of copies. We had a good printer that we bid it out to a whole bunch of different printers, and we ended up with one out of Naples, Florida, that has turned out to be perfect for us over the years. But anyway, that first book sold like hotcakes. I said, Jack, this is really easy. Let's do some more. So since then, he and I have written 5 books together, and I've written 4 children's books and a couple of other books. And I, you know, between the newspaper writing and the history writing and knocking out a book here and there every year or two, I always thought the final challenge was fiction. Because as a historian, you know, your approach is to go into a room, a big room, and it's got a whole lot of stuff in it, and your job is to organize that stuff and make it have some kind of logical flow. You got to obviously backtrack and check all of your sources to make sure you got it accurate. But that's a process that I was, you know, pretty good at because I taught history for so long, and that was my major in college. Jack, I think, was the writer. I'm more the historian, but he's the guy with, you know, the commas and the semicolons and all that. He knows how to do that. On the other hand, fiction, the way I look at it is you go into a big room and there's nothing in there. And you got to create what's in there. So I always thought that is the pinnacle of writing. And I'd never done it. And I always thought, I'm going to do this. But I never really could figure out how I was going to do it and when I was going to do it. And I was 67 years old. I can remember when I said to myself, I'm going to do this and I'm going to finish it by my 70th birthday. Gave myself a 3-year window. I'm not a real disciplined person. You talk to some people that are writers, they write between 6 and 8 in the morning or 1 and 2 in the middle of the night or something. I don't do that. I write in spurts. I write sometimes, you know, I get an idea and I just go up and I'm going along with the computer and my wife says, come on, supper time. I say, no, I'm on an idea. So I write like that. I don't have a real organized plan. And I knew that I had to do a self-imposed deadline or else I'd never finish the thing. So not having ever written a novel, I thought, well, what will I write about? I'm not a mystery guy, you know, I don't car chases and that stuff. I don't know, murders, I'm not into that. But I love history, and I thought, I want to write a history of my town. I want to write a history of the town I grew up in. But all histories of towns are pretty much boring. And it's because they're data driven. You go to the town report, you say, oh, in 1943 they appropriated $100 for the town Christmas tree. And the school budget was $345,000. You know, you can just get inundated with just minutia. And I thought, I don't want to do this. I mean, Brewster has an interesting history. It was part of Harwich until 1803. And so that history had already been written, the history of Harwich from 1695, I think, when they became a town, to 1803. It covered Brewster, which was the north parish of Harwich. So that was already written. And Brewster had a lot of sea captains in the 19th century, and there's a lot of maritime history about sea captains, and a lot of Brewster captains are mentioned, so I thought, well, I don't want to go in that direction. But the 20th century, there's nothing written about what happened in Brewster. There's a couple of picture books, but for the most part, nothing was ever written. I thought, well, there's something, you know, the 20th century was a big deal. I mean, I lived half of it, and I thought it was important. And so I thought, okay. But then I thought, I can't just go to the town reports and start all this out. So I thought, what I should do is to create a character, a fictitious character who is set in the town and lives through the 20th century into the beginning of the 21st century, and he has to experience all of the things that Brewster and Cape Cod experienced over his lifetime. So I did that, and I thought, well, what am I going to do? Who am I going to have? I had to think about the character. Well, I have some relatives buried in the Brewster Cemetery. There's an old section and there's a new section. My relatives are in the new section. Well, I'm driving through the old section. I saw a headstone and it said, Foster, Crosby, Sears. Well, I said, that's a bunch of real traditional names. I ought to be able to pull something together here. Well, I grew up, when I was in high school, I worked on the highway department, and I had some old timers there, and one of them was named Washington Chase. And I thought, I like that name, because we always called him Washy. So I'll have his first name be Washy, and then I'll have Foster as his middle name, and Sears, because there's a lot of them. And so my character was Washington Foster Sears. I had him born in 1907, the same year my mother was born. and I had him live through his growing years and up until the beginning of the 21st century. I gave him 100 years of life, and then I ended his life, and that's one of the great things about fiction. You can knock people off whenever you want to. I ended his life 2 days before his 100th birthday. And there was a reason for that, and if you read the book, you'll find out why. But some people say, is this a history book? What is this, a memoir? What is this? It's a lot of things. It is a history book because I relied on newspapers, I relied on the town reports, I interviewed a lot of the old timers. There are some old tapes done by the Tales of Cape Cod that interviewed people in the 1930s, 40s. So I pulled all this stuff together. So that's real. But for example, in World War I, when Ray Tubman and a few of the other boys from Brewster got on the train and went to Camp Devens to train, I just inserted a fictitious person to go with them. And it happened to be a brother of Washington Foster Sears. And so I was able to do it that way. So people say, well, is it real? Yes, it is real. Is it a memoir? Well, to a degree, because a lot of my childhood experiences I put in as Washi was growing up. For example, I knew a man who hunted turtles, and he lived up the street from me, and he would take me with him once in a while. And what he would do in the fall, the big snapping turtles go down into the mud, and they go dormant for the winter. And he had this big long pole with a crook on the end of it, and he'd be wading up to about here, and he'd be poking along, and he would hit one, thunk. Now if you hit a rock, it was a clack, but a thunk, you had something. So you reached in with that crook, pulled him out. Of course he's, asleep. You don't want to get too warm a day though, they wake up fairly quickly. You throw him in a burlap bag, and you bring him back to the truck, and you take him home. Well, the thing was though, you can't send one turtle to New York. You got to send a barrel of turtles, and they got to be alive. So he would go and get the turtles, and to keep them, he had the typical Cape Cod dirt cellar. And he'd bring them down there in the dark, put them in the cellar, and they'd sort of dig in, and they'd fall asleep again. And then when he had enough, he'd put them and send them out Railway Express. And I watched him do this. And so I put that in the book. I had Washi Sears, the young man, be sort of me going along with this old timer, whose name was interesting. His name was Washington Irving Eldridge. We called him Poet when I was growing up because of Washington Irving. So there were these kinds of characters like that I grew up with that were still there and still were around the Cape in that period of time in the 1950s. The funny thing was, and I did put it in the book, my character who caught those turtles, he said everything worked fine. He said, except my wife Polly, sometimes on rainy days she likes to hang the laundry in the cellar. And she said when she steps on those things, she gives me hell, So anyway, those kinds of stories. Growing up in the Depression, I heard the stories from a lot of people about life here in the 1930s. I put some of that in there. The period of rum running, which was a big deal around Cape Cod, I've got some of that in there. Matter of fact, Washi's brother is in the rum running business for a period of time in the 1920s. Then we get into World War II, and Washi was a little old for World War II. He was born in 1907, so he was in his mid-30s. He wasn't subject to the draft, but like a lot of men, he wanted to be in the military and be part of it. So his background, as he matured out of high school, he drove a lot of heavy equipment. He was a bulldozer operator, and so it was a perfect match for him to become a Navy Seabee. Now, I knew the Navy pretty well because I spent 26 years in the active and Naval Reserve and did a lot of work with the Seabees, so I was able to pull that in and make Washi be a Seabee in the Pacific Theater of World War II. Now, as far as the love life of Washi goes, I had to be real careful with this because, if it's a memoir, I don't want my own peccadillos in there. But I did give him a romance that went sour, which was a reflective of my own life in that period of time, and probably many of us that, the first love wasn't always the one that was going to carry through. But then during the war, there was a young widow who started to write to him. She'd lost her husband at Normandy. He was just a young GI that was killed there. And she had a small baby. And so they hit it off after the war. Now, when he came back to Brewster after the war, it hadn't really changed much from the time, he'd grown up there. He still had less than 1,000 people. And this is about the time when I was coming into my own in Brewster, growing up, going to elementary school. So instead of having, Washi was too old to have kids in the elementary school, but I had his adopted daughter, and then they had a son. They went to the elementary school that I did. And so I talked about my teachers teaching Washi's son. I put them all in there. Some people in Brewster accused me of putting all the names of all the people I knew in there so they'd all buy the book. That isn't really why I did it, but I wanted people to remember small town life on the Cape, and I think it applies anywhere, how the changes come. They're subtle, but they are almost irrevocable. Once the changes come, it's hard to go back. It's like that old story, can you go home again? And I don't know if you can. So anyway, he dealt with this, his issues in his family. There were some humorous ones that were in there that I remembered growing up, and people told me the story, so I put those in there. His son, his name was Cyrus. He named it after his wife's grandfather. Well, Cyrus, and his middle name was Joshua. They called him CJ. I had a very close friend I'm an only child, and he was like an older brother to me. He was 2 years older than me in high school. And he was killed in Vietnam in February of 1967 as a second lieutenant. I wanted to remember him in this book, but I didn't want to use his name. So I created CJ, the son, who becomes a Marine, and he's killed right at the period of Tet in Vietnam. And so he has to deal with these issues that were contemporary that I had feelings about, and that people in Brewster had feelings about. And everybody that read the book said, well, you know who you were talking about, which is kind of fun too, in a way, in that I created characters that were kind of thinly drawn. I didn't give the right names, but people would say, oh, I know who that is. And I never would say, yeah, you're right. Because I'm a student of Joseph Crosby Lincoln. And if you know Joe Lincoln, he was Cape Cod's most prolific author. Now, he's been forgotten, which is sad, but he wrote between 1903 to 1944, and he wrote about 40 some odd novels, which were really big sellers, and he was serialized in magazines and everything. And he used what he called composites. And that's what I did. I took people that I knew, and I changed their names, drew them kind of thinly, but I would never say, yes, that's who it is. Only my wife knows. So that's how I put the book together. And then after, the 1970s and 80s, that's when the Cape really began to change. All kinds of new things came along. And this is when Washi, in his older life period, has to kind of deal with the changes we're dealing with now. And there are issues related to water pollution, overfishing, air quality, all kinds of things. Taxes, he had a nice 7-acre piece of property down by the water, and it was nice until they started that 100% valuation, which was probably 1960s, early 70s, when the state then said you can't just assess the way you want to. You have to do full fair value. So, you're sitting on 7 acres of land on the Cape Cod Bay, it's going to be pretty expensive. He had no income, and that was the story of a lot of people that I knew. They were land rich and money poor. They had to sell, and they had to subdivide. And that began, I think that was sort of a nudge to develop. There were a lot of other reasons for developing, but the fact that you couldn't sit on a big piece of property like a farm because the value was just too great and you couldn't afford the taxes, well, that affected him. So I think a lot of people identified with that. I also have a character who comes from off Cape who builds a giant mansion on the beach. You can all kind of identify with that when he started putting the private beach signs up and the television cameras on the roof, so that in November, if you're walking in front, you might get a police car coming down because, you know, he's called. That sort of thing is real. It's real. But I took care of him pretty well. I'm not going to tell you what happened, but I have been told that the person who took some action has become a great hero to people who read the book. And then I say, listen, I'm not advocating what he did. I don't want to get on the, you know, on a stump and say this is a way to take care of this sort of thing. But it's a real issue. Really, the lack of public access to our beaches. When I was a kid, I'd ride my bicycle to the beach. There would be like 25 people. I had my dog with me. There's no such thing as a beach sticker. I know that, you know, all these things have to come because of the crowd and because of the demand for what we have, but they affect people. And it's interesting that people that have read the book, they'll say to me, you know, this is kind of a sad story, and I didn't intend it to be sad, but it is. It's melancholy, because as we age, all of us, we look back, and maybe through some rose-colored glasses, certainly, and we look back at an earlier time that was simpler, easier to manage. The challenges seemed simpler, and we wish we could maybe go back, but we can't. And so I think the book does have a melancholy flavor to it, because I can't drive through places that I've known for 70 plus years and not say, wow, I remember this. I remember what it was. I remember when the dairy farm was there, and now it's condos. I can remember when the 9-hole golf course where I caddied didn't have a water system, and the guy drove a big truck, a water truck down every morning, so that the only grass was in the middle of the fairway. But it was small, it was simple, it was, you know, the delivery of milk in the morning with that much cream on the top in the glass bottles. Those things that young people have no idea what they're about, but people our age remember them, and I wanted that to be in there. So when I told you about the process at age 67, I said, I got to finish this by age 70. Now, I work upstairs in my office quite a bit in front of the computer, and I'm up there all the time. My wife is usually saying, what are you doing up there? You know, and I said, oh, I'm busy. Well, my 70th birthday, I came downstairs. I had a binder with 300 single-line pages in it. And I said, this is what I've been doing. She was stunned. She had no idea. You know, I write and submit stuff to newspapers, and I was doing some other books with Jack, but this was what I was working on. And she's a pretty good critic, I have to say. You know, she's honest. And she said, oh, you know, and she started reading it. And she read it without stopping. And at the end, she said, you know, this isn't bad. Now, for her to say that was pretty good for me. I don't usually get that much positive, you know, but she said this was pretty good. So what I did is I made 20 copies of this big binder. It was this thick. And I gave it to about 20 people my age that grew up in Brewster at the same time I did. Because I still maintain a contact with a lot of people. And I said, read this, tell me what you think. Well, I think I got about 15 of them back. 5 of them probably went in the wastebasket. But the 15 were very helpful to me, because these were people that said, yeah, you know, you got an idea here. But don't forget, there was Donald Doan was the guy that ran the general store, not Tim Dibble. You know, make sure you get it right. So, okay, thanks. And, you know, they helped me. They really gave me some positive contribution to where I was going. So now I had the book, 3 years of research, and I was going to go through the usual process. I had Jack read it. Usually whenever we do a book, we give it to a couple of retired English teachers to make sure that the flow is good and we haven't really goofed up the grammar. So I said, I think Jack, I'm going to get an editor this time. Never did before. So I happen to, you know, I belong to the Cape Cod Writers, and you know, there's a network in there, and I found an editor, and I, you know, met her with her. I showed her what I had, and she said, well, I'll take this on. But then she said to me, she said, you're not going to like me when this is done. I said, what? What do you mean? Well, she said, you just handed me a binder this thick with 300 pages. How many words do you have, Jim? I said, I got 170,000 words. She said, you know that a novel is usually between 80 and maybe 100,000 words? What are you trying to write? Gone with the Wind on Cape Cod? She said, this is going to have to be cut. I said, what do you mean? I said, I worked 3 years to develop all this stuff. She said, it's got to be cut. And she started to cut. And she cut. And every time she cut, it was like something going through my heart. I mean, she would say, this character has nothing to do with the theme that you really want to, you want to emphasize Brewster, its change, and the feelings that people had as things were changing. Why have you got all this stuff about the Battle of Iwo Jima? Well, I said, he was there. That's not important. Why have you got this stuff about the hippies living in Northern California? I said, well, his daughter went out there and she was in a commune. Not important. You know, and she was cutting. And I was not liking. Well, I understood what she was doing, you know, and she said, you know, people don't like long chapters. You know, you get a chapter that goes on, people are going to forget what it was at the time they get to the end of the chapter, what the beginning was. So she shortened chapters. She threw out chapters. We honed it together. We worked. Finally, I think we were down to about 115,000 words. And I said, Barbara, I said, I can't cut anymore. I want to keep it the way it is. And she said, all right. She said, I think we can go with this. So that was it. I drew the line, and she was good about it. And I didn't dislike her at the end. I said, Barbara, and matter of fact, I give her a lot of credit. She made the book readable. She got rid of all the strands that were going in directions I didn't need to go in. And so then, you know, went through the usual process. I am fortunate in that I own the company that prints the books. So I don't have to write letters to editors or anybody else or, you know, producers of books. I just decide when I want to produce it. There is a drawback on owning your own company, and that is you got to put the money up yourself, which is okay, because, you know, I believe in, Jack and I, we've been very successful. We've sold 60,000 books in the last 18 years. So none of our books have lost money. We don't make a lot of money, but, you know, we're solvent, and the two of us are able to go out to dinner once in a while, and that sort of thing. So I said, well, I want to get this done, and I want it to be done by the fall of 2016. Now, it took me, I would say, 3/4 of a year to really sit with the editor, get it all chopped down, and then, you know, I use the same printer, which is out of Naples, Florida, and I sent it to them. I had the graphic designer, and then it came with the cover is really, you know, when you write a book, the cover is really the key, because you go in any bookstore, there's lots of books, and you have to have some reason for a person to take your book. So I'd say that the cover is 50% of the initial attraction of the book. And I happen to know a Brewster artist, and in February of the year I published it, which was 2016, I went to her with the manuscript. And by this time it had been cut down to a degree where it wasn't like... But anyway, I said, look, I want to get, this is a story. I want you to read the story and tell me what you got that might fit. And she has a website. She had all this artwork on there. She's a watercolorist and an acrylic painter. And I looked at the stuff on the website. I said, you know, I'm not really sold on anything there. I said, this is a story about a waterfront property. Sears Point is a real place. It's right on Cape Cod Bay. And I said, you know, there were fish weirs out here, and there was a lot of eelgrass, and I remembered as a kid a certain way, and I want this to be looking at. She said, all right. She said, don't worry. Now, this was like in February, middle of the winter. Well, I would say probably by about the second week in March, she calls me up. She said, I got something for you to look at. Now, she had two nice views, exactly what I wanted. One was acrylic, one was watercolor. And I had a hard time picking it, but I said, this is it, Karen. This is what it is. And I think that cover has done as much to sell the book as what's in the book. And between Barbara Clark, who is my editor, and Karen North Wells, who has the Underground Gallery in Brewster, they are really like more than 50% of what I am as I stand here with the book. So the book came out. I wanted to get it out before Christmas, and I initially, I ran 500 copies. I thought, if I have to give 490 of them away, I don't care. I wanted to do this. I wasn't in the business to make money. I just wanted to do it because I wanted Brewster as it was and Cape Cod as it was to be remembered, to be lived through by this character. And I didn't care if I had to give them all away. Well, believe it or not, they all sold. I put another 500 order in. They were gone before Christmas. I did that. And just this past week, I've ordered another 500. So they seem to be going. And people, I thought it would only be directed toward Brewster. I said, this is us, you know, when we were growing up. But they say there's a sort of a universal quality to the book in the aging process of an individual who lives in a place all his life and sees it change. And the challenges of life, whether they be physical, whether they be financial, whatever else, they're universal. The problems with kids, our own kids or somebody else's kids, they're universal. The problems with love, interest, and marriage, they have a quality that apply to everyone. And I think that's what people have picked up on. And I'm kind of surprised because I have the book on Amazon as an ebook, and it's really done well. I have no idea who these people are that are reading it, but they're not from Brewster. And I'm very pleased with that. So that's kind of the story of how I wrote it, why I wrote it, and I'm not sure if I left anything out, but you know, when I told you that going into the room and having to create something, you know, you have to think about plot, character, protagonist, all that stuff. I did have some experience because when I wrote this book in 2002, it is a mini fictional story. And this is the book that if ever I'm remembered for anything in this world, it will be for Clarence the Cranberry Who Couldn't Bounce. I've written 4 children's books and illustrated them, which is another thing I like to do. And I get to go into the first grade now, in the second grade. Now, I was a high school teacher for about almost 30 years. The kids never were really excited to see me come in the room. Matter of fact, it was like, let's go. But the first grade, I never knew what happened in the first grade. You can see the light bulb go on. They're excited. They want to tell you a story. You know, I ask, hey kids, you got any questions? They all start telling me stories. And it's just such a lot of fun. My wife said that I missed my calling. I should have probably been an elementary school teacher because I love to get down on the floor with the kids and they're telling me stories. They draw me pictures, and usually after I've been in the first grade, a week or so later, I'll get a package from their teacher. And the kids will have done stories about where's Clarence going to go. I mean, they've got Clarence going on a train to California. They got him on a spaceship, and their imaginations are just terrific. And so that's an aspect of you know, of my writing that I think I like as much as anything. The only real history book I ever wrote, and you know, it did well. This is a book about Cape Cod women who went to sea in the 19th century with their sea captain husbands. And Falmouth is very much into the mix on that because there were a number of Falmouth women, particularly whaling wives, who went to sea in the 19th century. And so what I originally started to do with this book was I wanted to get a whaling wife or a merchant ship captain wife from every town on Cape Cod, 15 towns. But there are a couple of towns I couldn't find any. But Falmouth, I found 3 or 4. So they're in there. And of course, I had to put in some for Brewster too. But this book is really a history book. It has footnotes. So, you know. So that's it. That tells you my story, tells you what the book is about. And now I think maybe we might have some questions and answers, if I can give you the answers. Do you have some? Yes.
Start off. You worked on this for 3 years. You worked with an editor. You had, I think you said 15 beta readers who reviewed it for
Yep.
you. As you refined it, it got better and better and better, presumably. How did you know when you were done?
Well, you know, as a historian, you know, I started in 1907 with this character, and I went through all the history things, local and some national, international events. And when I got to 2007, that was 100 years. I knew I had to bring his life to an end there. And writing toward that end date, I think I knew when I was there, there wasn't anything more I was going to be looking for to add to his life. I think at that point I just wanted to get rid of the too many clauses, too many adjectives, and that's a lot of the honing that made the writing better. I always tell anybody that writes, and certainly is for students, I always say, look, when you write something, it's not the final draft. When you write something, you put it in a drawer and then come back to it 2 or 3 days later, and you're going to have a whole lot of different directions to go in. You're going to say, wow, why didn't I use this word, or I'll get rid of that word. It just really is like, it's like spaghetti. It's always better a couple days after the first time you cook it. Yes?
What are you working on now?
Well, that's a good question. I am working on one, and I'll tell you my approach to it. I wrote the towns of Brewster's history using a fictitious character, and I thought, why couldn't I really write the whole history of Cape Cod using characters that were not only fictitious but real ones as well? And so about a year ago I started working on it, and it's been a slow process, but one of my favorite writers, who's long gone now, but James Michener, his book Chesapeake and his other book Centennial, they tell the history of a place using fictitious characters that have real connections to history. And so I thought, why can't I start out with some Native Americans? How about the first explorers coming in? And what about the Vikings that may have come here? What about the offshoots from the Pilgrims who settled down here? What about the Quakers who came from Sandwich to settle West Falmouth and were connected to people in this area? Why can't I create characters who dealt with the issues that those people in real life had to deal with and bring it right up? As a matter of fact, in the whole scope of the thing, I've got a displaced single mother living in Nickerson Park because her winter rental is now being rented out to the summer people, and she's got to live in a tent with her 3 daughters. That's real, and that's the history of the Cape right up to the present time. So it's an ambitious thing. Whether I'll ever get it done, I don't know. Like, when it's good weather, I'm outside. That's one of the good things about living here on Cape Cod or in New England, is that you really have to be in the house from November to April, and that's when I do the most of the writing. If it's nice out, I'm out. But that's what I'm working on. And whether anything is going to come of it, I have no idea. But I love to write, and I love to. Sometimes I get a buzz. Matter of fact, I'm coming over here to the Falmouth Historical Society. I was trying to get over here this summer, but I've been so busy. But there is a story about a group of Falmouth women in the 1830s who were, I'm not going to call them proto-feminists, but they were women who were involved in the abolition movement. And they wrote petition letters to Congress to take up the issue of slavery. Now, this was about 1835. And their story isn't that well known, but I've got the name of a couple of them, and I want to work them into a chapter of the book. Because one of them was a Quaker, and she was getting in her husband wasn't real keen on her taking up the pen and writing, signing these petitions. And I can see there's probably some discord in the house, So I want to bring that in, but I want those women to be known. So that would be a chapter, and I'm on my way over to Falmouth probably in September. They've got the more of the biographies of the 6 women that I'm interested in that are in that archive. So yeah, there's just lots of stuff. Did I see another question?
Well, you were talking about the cover, and I wasn't clear. Did somebody actually do it, paint it in that interval that you were looking for it, or?
Yes. What she did, I told you, I went over there in February, and she didn't have anything in her stock pictures that I thought really worked.
Yeah.
So she called me up, I think the second week of March, said, I was on the beach, I painted the picture, and I've got 2 of them, and take the choice, and I did, and I think it was a really good, and it shows the flats at low tide. My main character, Washi Sears' father, Nathan, was a weir fisherman. If you know what a weir is, it's a passive trap. On both sides of the Cape, they were very common, but on the bay side, the tide goes out, so they could go out with a horse and team and harvest. And that's what his father did And so I wanted the flats to be there. The house, which I had, I created that house built in the 1700s by one of the ancestors of the Sears family. So, yeah, there's a lot of history in it, and I think, a lot of life. Yes.
Any movie thought, like making it into a movie?
Well, it's funny. I have no thoughts of that at all.
Yeah.
But Karen, who's the artist, she's got a boyfriend who lives in Provincetown, and he's some kind of a director of something, and she said, this should be a movie. And I said, Karen, you run with it, whatever you come up with, I don't care. But again, my purpose in writing this was just to kind of grab that period of time and try to hold it, mainly for people our age. I don't think young people I'd probably identify with it at all, but I didn't want to be gone from the scene without putting this down. And that's, if nothing else, that's what I did. And every book that gets sold is kind of like, it amazes me because I never wrote a novel, and again, I just, when I read it, I think it's pretty good. I was down at the Brewster bookstore, I think last Friday doing a signing, and it was kind of dull, nothing was happening. When I was reading the book, I thought, hey, this is pretty good. Yes?
When I interviewed my grandmother, she had a story about how the panic of '87 affected her life. So my question is how, when these events from the outside world, when they impinge on local life, are you tempted to follow like one event and go into depth at any length?
An example would be,
I mean, you pruned out really good deeds in that direction.
an example, I've got Washi, he's probably 20, 21, 22, and he's working for the Knobscusset Hotel, which is one of the many of the grand hotels that were on the Cape. The Chatterbar's Inn is the only one left of that type, where the wealthy people came. Well, when the Depression came, those people didn't come anymore. Washi lost his job. And so at that point, he was unemployed, and a little bit of serendipity, he was doing some odd jobs, but there was a big forest fire down in Wellfleet, which those fires are very common. Railroad would set them on fire in the dry weather, the sparks would come out. And it was a big fire, and he ended up, like a lot of men, they volunteered to go down. Anytime these fires, they would get a big brigade to go down to wherever it was. And he just decided that instead of shoveling and digging ditches, he would drive a bulldozer, which he had never done before. And he got on it, and he figured it out. And at the end, the fellow who owned the bulldozer said, I know you never knew how to drive this thing because you never shut it off. And he said, yeah. He said, you're a good guy. Why don't you come and work for me? And so that got him his start as an equipment operator. So that was a kind of specific thing. The rum running period was a pretty violent period, especially once the syndicates and the big mobsters got involved in it. The early years, kind of small stuff, but there was a very violent act that happened over here off of Cuddy Hunk, and it was a rum runner called the John Dwight. And there was a shootout out there, and about 8 men were killed, and they drifted ashore over on Nobska or Noshaw. And so I had his brother involved in the rum running business, and he was one who was killed in that shootout. So the John Dwight was real. But I wanted to show that, there was a lot of violence, and we kind of have a romantic view of the rum runners, but there was some good nasty stuff that came out of it, and it wasn't all Al Capone, it was around here. And so those are real events that affected the family. And of course, the Vietnam War with my friend who died, I put him in there too. So those kinds of things.
I enjoyed your discussion of the town meeting and where he became a town equipment
Highway surveyor, yeah.
highway person. It was something I could resonate wherever you've got selectmen this form of government that we have on the Cape in many different places, representing the town meeting.
Well, if you've been around the Cape for a while, certainly back in the 1940s, 50s, even into the 60s, the selectmen were a very interwoven bunch. They were family members, cousins, uncles, and in the case of the highway department, I remember this, we never knew where the equipment was because, you know, the highway surveyor's brother-in-law wanted the road grader and he was doing a private project somewhere up in the back end of town. So he said, yeah, take it, but make sure you bring it back. Well, half the stuff never came back. And we go to work in the morning and say, hey, where's the front end loader? Oh, Denny Coogan has it. He's over on the cranberry bog. You gotta go. You know, this was the way things were done then. You know, it was just family, and you couldn't really say to your, you know, your cousin or your brother-in-law, no, you can't have it. You know, it was the way things were done, and it's funny to think about, but that was real. Well, yes.
I'm curious about your career choice. Obviously, you must have gone off Cape for college. And was teaching a way to come back, or was teaching
Yes.
the main goal?
No, that was a way to come back. I grew up in Brewster, went through 1 through 8 at Brewster Elementary School. I had 100 kids in the whole school. I only had 12 in my class. I went to DY, there was 130 of us there. I went to Boston College. And then it was 1966, and the war was ramping up, and I wasn't too keen on the idea of it. So I went out to the West Coast and I went to graduate school. I was kind of hiding out there. And then my friend got killed. And it kind of was like an epiphany. I said, you know, he gave his life. I shouldn't be hiding out here in graduate school. So I joined the Navy, took a commission, and did 4 years of service. Then, you know, I wanted to come back. And yet that 10 years from 1962 to 72, there were dramatic changes. And there were dramatic changes in the schools. When I left in 1962, the schools were very orderly, you know, and it was quiet. I got back in 72 and I started teaching. I was in a world that I didn't understand. And I don't know if I ever caught up with it because the school just changed so much. The demographics of the school changed. We had poor kids that were immigrant kids that I never even, you know, when I was growing up, there were no immigrant kids from Mexico or some other place. We weren't, if you never heard here Spanish or anything else. There was no such thing as special needs, or at least it wasn't recognized. I mean, these are whole changes that I never anticipated, and I don't know if I ever really caught up with myself. But I wanted to come back to the Cape, and I'm glad I did. Well, you've been great. These seats are probably not the most comfortable, and I hope you didn't put off your suppers. But I did bring some books, and if you don't have one, they're discounted to $10, which is a 20% savings. And I'll sign them and personalize them for you. And other than that, I appreciate you coming, and I thank you for being such a good curious. Thank you.